Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt, the deputy leader of the SDP.
And I'm Sebastian Moore, a member of the Young Social Democrats. As usual, we have a podcast of 3 halves for you. 3 halves, that doesn't make sense, does it? 3 halves. 2
mathematicians on the call. That's not going to help us, is it?
So in the first section, we're going to talk about the news, and in particular, the 2 big stories, really. Obviously, we're going to talk about the budget, and we've got a financial expert in the room in the form of hilary.salt. So we're going to get really into the numbers. We're also going to talk about the US election. We can't really avoid it. And that is coming up on Tuesday. So we're going to talk about some of the controversy surrounding comments that people made at a Trump rally. And then we are going to move on to the Bring Me Solutions section, where we have an expert in the field of assisted dying, a man named Kevin Yuill, is going to come and speak to us about that subject. And then finally, we'll finish off with Culture Club, in which we'll talk about a few things. I've got a couple of things to talk about in Culture Club. Are we going to spoil what we're going to talk about in Culture Club?
No.
No spoilers?
No spoilers.
Okay.
You'll have to wait.
You'll have to wait till the end of the show.
So, but before we do any of that, Sebastian, I have to say that we've had a complaint.
Oh no, is it from my dad?
No, the complaint I've received is from avid listener Sarah, who said that in the first episode I introduced myself and I invited you to introduce yourself, but you were so excited to tell people what social democracy was that you then forgot to introduce yourself. So I think everybody's left thinking, who is this nicely spoken young man? So do you want to say a few words about you?
So excited to talk about social democracy or terrified to talk about myself, one or the other. What is there to say? So I'm 28 years old. I grew up in Dorset, which I spent the week in Dorset this week visiting family. And I have to say, going back there this week has made me realise it is an absolutely spectacular place. And I'm so lucky to have grown up there. As a kid, I think you get used to your surroundings, but as an adult, you see it for how it is. And it really is. If anybody has not been to Dorset, go and visit the Isle of Purbeck, Lulworth Cove, Dildor. It's just magnificent. So I grew up in a quite a big family. As soon as I was able to leave, I did, because if anybody's from Dorset, they'll know there's not a lot there for young people. And I went abroad and worked as an English teacher. I lived in Spain, Italy, Romania, the Maldives. And I came back to England at the start of 2022, so nearly 3 years ago. And when I came back, I decided to live in Manchester, having never been here before, but knowing that I wanted to go up north because I thought, that's going to be a lot more exciting, having never really spent much time in the north.
Fine choice, very fine choice.
Right, and I do feel a bit of a northerner now. I don't know, maybe other northerners wouldn't accept me, but I see myself as a bit of a northerner. I was at an event recently and they said, oh, it's great to be in the north because people are more friendly here. And I found myself cheering, like, yay! And then I thought, oh, wait a second, I'm a southerner, aren't I? So that's it, that's me really. And then I joined the SDP by chance about a year ago. Somebody told me about the SDP, and that's why I find myself here, having stood in the general election recently. Great.
Well, there you go, Sarah, and everybody else.
Is that comprehensive?
That's a nice introduction to Sebastian. You know all about him now. So, given that you know all about him, it's probably good to move on. And I know you wanted to start off with a discussion on the US election, didn't you?
Yes. The most consequential election this year, I think we can all say that, even maybe begrudgingly, is coming up on Tuesday the 5th of November. Americans will go to the polls and they have a choice really between Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate, and Donald J. Trump, the Republican candidate. Do you think there's anybody out there listening to this podcast that hasn't heard of Donald Trump?
No.
He's probably the most famous person in the world, isn't he?
Possibly.
So I find, the whole thing just a fascinating, exciting spectacle as an outsider, because luckily it's not going to affect me as much as it will affect Americans. Although, having said that, we're all affected by what happens in the most powerful country in the world. So there's been a bit of a controversy in the final week leading up to the polls. Trump had a rally in New York, Madison Square Garden, and a comedian called Tony Hinchcliffe went on the stage and did a couple of jokes. One of them caused a lot of offence and has been being talked about in the media as a potentially a damaging thing to Trump. This is what he said.
There's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico. Okay. All right.
So that has got him in a lot of trouble, and supposedly, if you listen to mainstream media, is going to cause a lot of issues for Trump, because they would see the Latino community as a big part of his path to winning next Tuesday. Then following that comment, President Biden, he's still president if you believe it, he went on a call with Latino voters and he said this.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
So that was President Biden. And the first takeaway from this for me is it's amazing to think that 6 months ago, people, the mainstream media, people on the left, the Democratic supporters, were suggesting that this man was sharp.
Biden, you mean?
Biden, yeah, he's sharp. Cognitively, he's with it, right? And then you listen to something like that and you realise that regardless, it's like put your ideology aside and accept the fact that this man is not fit to be president if he's not able to get a sentence out, right? They're not even going after him for this because he's no longer the candidate. They've moved on to attacking Harris or attacking Trump.
Who is in charge of the US?
Yeah.
That's what kind of worries me, because clearly he isn't.
It's quite incredible, isn't it? So then the final thing to add about this is that Trump and the MAGA team, Make America Great Again, they've seized on this comment by Biden where he calls Trump supporters garbage, and Trump arrived at a rally in a bin lorry, as we would call it in Britain, a garbage truck. Is that right?
That sounds right. Yes. Yep.
And with a high-vis jacket on, and he's seized on it because Trump sees this as an opportunity, in the same way that when Hillary Clinton called his supporters a basket of deplorables, if you remember that in the build-up to the 2016 election. So I think it's interesting. I think these are slightly different situations. My assessment of it is that the joke that the comedian made is in no way comparable to the Hillary Clinton basket of deplorables comment, because
it was made by a comedian.
It was a comedian, yeah. And I think, all sorts of media outlets, including new media you'll find on YouTube, are going after this, saying this is a really concerning thing. I think this will put off a lot of people. Me personally, I don't think it will make one iota of difference, because people don't care about what a comedian says at a rally. They accept the fact that it's a joke. Whereas the Hillary Clinton comment, that actually gave people an insight into what she thought of Trump voters, of what she thought of many millions of Americans out there. This contempt that a lot of the elite politicians have for the average voter.
And Biden clearly has as well.
Exactly. So it's kind of history repeating itself in a weird way. I don't know, what do you make of all this?
I guess the thing that strikes me is just the level of the debate. The debate's a debate about name calling, when there are so many more important issues that the voters and the media should be concentrating on. Why do they get tied up in these almost, trivial and irrelevant discussions?
Right, yeah, exactly. And I think, I would add that my main takeaway from what's happening in America and the election is that we have to, as a country in the UK, we have to be careful not to follow in their footsteps, because I think the state of our democracy in the UK is bad. but it's not as bad as America. And there are certain reasons for that. I think our constitution, even though it's not a written constitution, our constitution is a little bit more resistant to change, and it causes, you look at Boris Johnson, the sort of figure like this, he wasn't able to do what Trump is able to do in America. But we do follow America in so many ways. So yeah, we don't want to go down this road of, oh, he said this and she said that, and you have to vote for this person because, you know, this other person thinks this. It's really playground politics. I hate it. I'm somebody that cares about policy. I care about people having a vision for the country, because we have to be, like, that's kind of why we're in politics, surely, you
Absolutely.
and I, like,
yes.
why we're doing this, because we have a vision for what we want the UK to be, and we want to be able to enact that vision or hash it out with our opponents.
Yes.
So that the best vision can win.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, going off name calling is quite concerning. But then, you know, American politics is entertainment, and I think, you know, there's a lot of darkness out there in the world, but I think we can laugh about it, and we can have a bit of fun with it. So I will be staying up on Tuesday night, and I will be. Oh yeah, I'm going to have the popcorn. I'll have a beer with me, and I'm going to enjoy it.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like something for you to build your week around. Get some sleep in advance, maybe.
Well, yeah, exactly. And just before we move on, I would just say, as a way of summarising what's going on with the political situation in America, of who's likely to win, etc. It's close, basically. It's very close. The BBC have said that there are 7 swing states, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. You've got 3 states up in the north, in the sort of the Midwest. You've got Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, the Rust Belt, and then you've got 4 states, and what they're deeming the Sun Belt. You know, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now, these are the states that they're fighting over. A lot of people have said whoever wins Pennsylvania will win the election. It is going to be close. So let me rephrase that. The polls have it close, but the polls didn't have it close in 2016, and Trump then won.
Yes.
Right? The polls said Hillary Clinton's going to win. Trump is doing better in the polls than he was in 2016 and 2020. Now, whether that's because they've adjusted for how wrong they got it in previous years, or whether it's he's actually going to go and have a landslide, who knows? I would say bits of wisdom you can take away. Don't trust the polls, right? And a lot of what we're projecting, so the 7 swing states, for example, that's based on previous performance. So they're looking at these states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But those states weren't that contentious as swing states in 2016. You know, a state that nobody talks about anymore, Florida, is just seen as a Republican state, right? But back then they would have seen it as a swing state. So it doesn't always follow the pattern you expect. And my prediction then is that we will have some surprise, you know, in terms of another state, one of those that is not one of those 7 will go to one of the other, if that makes sense. So I think that the electoral map will shift, as it has been shifting year after year.
My instinct is Trump has it.
Really?
Yeah.
Who do you want to win?
Neither of the above, I'm afraid.
We shall see, and it's going to be exciting nonetheless. Enjoy it, everyone. Like, do make the most of it. There's no point in being glum and dreary.
Absolutely, as you say, get the popcorn out.
Yes, indeed. Right then, so the big story in the UK this week, obviously, was the budget. Now, the budget. Can you just explain effectively what the budget is, and what does that mean for where we are?
But what the budget is the government kind of working out how it manages finances. So there's probably 3 big levers that the government has. They have ways that they can raise money through things like taxes. They have ways that they can spend money through the departments like the NHS or transport. And they can borrow money through the markets. So the 3 big levers they have. And what the budget does is to say, how shall we bring each of those into play to manage the country's finances?
And it's done annually, isn't it? So they set out the course for the year of how much they're going to tax people and how much they're going to spend.
That's right. Yes.
Anyway, tell us the headlines of this budget.
So, I mean, could probably talk about the budget for an hour, but we haven't got an hour. So I wanted to perhaps just pull out 3 points. The first is exactly how the rise in employer NI works and the scale of it, because I think it's easy to underestimate it. Second, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the complexity of the budget that Rachel Reeves announced. And thirdly, I want to talk about the way in which the OBR think that the changes will affect long-term growth. So 3 points because we have limited time. So the effect of the employer rise in NI. So the kind of headline is that it's rising by 1.2%, so from 13.8% to 15%. Now, this is the way this tax works is that when your employer pays you, they take aside an additional chunk of money that goes effectively direct to government. So you never see it. This goes directly from the employer to government. The way that the rise in employer NI works is that it's not just the fact that the rate has risen from 13.8 to 15. It's also the fact that the rate is levied on a higher proportion of your salary. So at the moment, employer NI doesn't start until somebody's earning over £9,000. So the first £9,000 of your pay, the employer doesn't pay NI on.
That's national insurance.
National insurance, correct. And they as well as the change to the percentage rate, they have lowered that slice of pay that isn't NI-able from £9,000 down to £5,000. So I promised you some maths. I just want to do a little bit of very simple maths. We're going to pick some round numbers just so you can see what's going on. So if we think about somebody on minimum wage who's perhaps not working quite full-time and they're earning £19,000 a year, at the moment the employer only pays NI on £10,000 of that because the first £9,000 is not NI-able. So 13.8% of £10,000 is... Oh, I wanted you to do the maths in your head, mental maths.
Crikey, sorry.
£1,380.
Yes, that makes sense. I was thinking about other things.
Young people can't do mental maths, is my experience. So, under the changes that the budget brings in, it's not £10,000 that will be subject to NI, but £19,000 less £5,000, so £14,000. So the employer national insurance would be 15% of £14,000, which is £2,100.
Right, so they're not only paying a higher percentage, but they're also paying on more of the salary because they're paying...
Correct. So that's more than a 50% increase
right.
in the employer NI that's going to be paid.
Mm-hmm.
Just another way of thinking about this, the pre the budget, the employer would pay 7.3% of pay as NI for this person on £19,000. After the budget, they pay 11%. So what you might think is, well, you know, the way that will come out in the wash is that next time the employees are looking for a wage rise, the employer will say, well, I've already spent nearly 4% on extra NI. I can only afford 1% pay rise for you. But remember, these are people on minimum wage. So actually the employer has no control over their wage rise. And in fact, they will be getting the much higher minimum pay from next year. So, you know, where does an employer who's got a lot of minimum wage people get that extra money from? And, you know, I could only think, you know, either it comes through in additional cost to provide whatever service they're providing or whatever product they're making, or it comes through in job cuts. And, you know, when you have job cuts and you have to get through the same amount of work, people have to work harder. So in terms of this being a budget for working people, it kind of, that feels a bit tricky, really, to make that argument. And remember that, you know, some of the people who do employ a lot of people on minimum wage are people who provide really important services like care homes. We know that a lot of care homes operate on a really, really tight budget. I just fear that this could drive some of those under. So I understand you have to raise tax if you want to invest and improve services, but this feels to me like an unhelpful way to do it.
And can you explain national insurance? What is national insurance? What's the point of it? Because it is just called that. It doesn't really necessarily mean it's insurance for the nation, right?
Well, no, it is. I mean, if you go back to the Beveridge, who introduced the whole national insurance system, you pay national insurance like you pay an insurance premium. And because you pay your national insurance premium, you get your basic state pension when you get to retirement age. Because you pay national insurance, if you're unable to work, you get sickness benefit. If you're out of work, you get unemployment benefit. And that relationship between you paying the premiums and you getting the benefit is really important, I think. So it is an insurance system for the nation. That is exactly the idea behind it.
And does it still work like that today? Because I've heard a lot of people say you could just merge national insurance with income tax.
It does and it doesn't. So it does to the extent that your contribution record is still the thing that entitles you to benefit and to the state pension. So it still works at that level. It kind of doesn't work in that I don't think people anymore kind of see it in that kind of political way as being a settlement that was reached with the nation post-war where, you know, we paid a premium and we were all in it together. I think some of those principles have been lost along the way. And I think that's a problem. You know, I would really like to reinvigorate that idea that it's not just a tax. It is about us collectively providing to support ourselves in the bad times.
Okay, point number 2.
So that kind of leads on quite nicely, really, because the second problem I have with the budget is that there's so many complicated little rises. It's like, you know, somebody's put together a spreadsheet with loads of drop-down boxes and they've just dropped down this box and that box to get the right answer. And there's no kind of political rationale or explanation behind what they're doing. You know, they're just doing all these things to get the right amount of money. And I think it would have been perhaps more honest to put 2p or 3p on income tax. But before you do that, to have the discussion with the nation that says, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And I do think that, you know, in many ways, the time for the Labour Party to have done that would have been in its election manifesto. But actually, its election manifesto was all about, we're not going to raise taxes, which, you know, all of that feels a bit dishonest to me. So, and the other thing about making the tax system more and more complex is that it just makes everything less efficient. So I was just looking up with the rates of national insurance that employers pay, and they pay one rate for ordinary workers, they pay a different rate for apprentices, they pay a different rate if you're in an enterprise zone. That means that if you're an employer, running payroll just gets more and more complicated. And the more complicated we make the system, the less efficient businesses are. So, you know, again, that's another reason why I think much more simplicity in the tax system would be better.
Just on the honesty point, because this seems to be a big takeaway from the budget this week, is that Labour during the elections said we're not going to put up taxes, and they were very sheepish whenever they were being asked about that from journalists. And yet now what have they done? They've put up taxes. And that was kind of obvious. We all knew that. And it's very, very weird that we all know what's going to happen, and yet nobody is really talking about it. Like, nobody's being honest about what they're doing. I think us as social democrats, we'd be fine to say, yes, people should pay a fair share of tax. That's how the state works, so that we can provide good public services. But Labour are so scared of being pushed into that corner. And I would say, as you know, a party like ours, the SDP, we have to own that. We have to say, yeah, taxes are going to go up or are going to be a certain amount in order to pay for public services.
Correct. Absolutely. I agree with that. My third point, if I can, it is just around what does all this do to growth? So the tax rises and the budget announcements that have been made effectively say that spending will increase by about 70 billion for the next 5 years. So you might think, well, great, you know, that's going to improve services, that's going to fire growth, that's going to, allow us to grow UK PLC. But I was reading the OBR's Economic and Fiscal Outlook. I would recommend everybody to read that. It looks a bit daunting, but actually it's quite a nice. I think it's quite nicely written. It's a good document to.
I have to say, I understood a lot of it, and I thought to myself, "Wow, they've written this in a way in simple English so that people can understand it." I thought that's really admirable.
Yes.
It's not written in jargon.
Yeah, it is. It's good. Let's give them their due there. I just wanted to read one sentence from the executive summary to you. It says, "Budget policies temporarily boost output in the near term, but leave GDP largely unchanged in 5 years." So all that extra spending, all that extra tax rising, effectively makes no difference, is what the OBR says. And to me, that's a pretty damning judgment on the budget, because, the government are claiming they have a growth agenda. So, why is it that all this extra spending doesn't really fire GDP and make us a lot richer?
Yeah, and my personal feelings towards it, and I'm, it must be noted, I'm no expert in these areas, but my personal feelings is that the media are talking about this as if it's a really bold budget, as if they're doing lots. I don't really see that. And I think the average person on the street will look at this budget and go, okay, like national insurance is going up for employers. That doesn't sound like the best thing. NHS is getting more money. Well, the NHS always gets more money. That's what politicians will always do, because they know it's such a popular thing. It's like, I don't really see that there's a great deal of change in this budget. That's my personal takeaway from it. So
what you said there, your words were, you don't see it doing a lot. I think that's right, but they are spending a lot.
Yes.
£70 billion is not an insignificant amount to spend, and about a third of that is going on capital spending. So you would actually expect that to shift the dial.
But I'd love to see, and obviously you, having worked in this field for so long, you'll recognise the pitfalls of doing more radical things, but I'd love to see something more radical. And I think a lot of people would, because we know what's happened. Like, there's a big difference between the theory of, the budget on paper and just living your life and looking around and what's going on. And I think people would love to see just something, like, let the budget reflect the feeling on the ground, which is that something big needs to happen. Let's do something big. And them saying that they're going to raise the bus fare to the cap of the bus fare to £3. It's like, oh, now I'm going to be paying £1 extra when I get on the bus. We don't feel the sense that, that anything is going to change.
I think that's right, yeah, and certainly the OBR's view is that it isn't. So that's quite a downbeat reflection on the budget. I think there are some good things in it. We should just, pause and say there are some good things in it. Some of the spending on things like infrastructure and transport, I think, are good. But, overall, I'm a little bit disappointed.
Welcome to Bring Me Solutions, the part of the show where we get an expert on to talk about a topic that really isn't delved into enough, because we've said this many times, that as politicians, really, as people that have stood for Parliament, it's easier just to talk about the problems and not talk about a little bit more in depth about what we can do about some of these things. So today we've got an expert on assisted suicide that is joining us. So welcome, Kevin Yuill, SDP member, author of Assisted Suicide, The Liberal Humanist Case Against Legalisation. And you're also let me get this right, an emeritus, I can't say that word. Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Sunderland.
Correct. Means they don't pay me anymore.
What is emeritus? Is that just what it means, emeritus?
It's basically because you get a title that, you've earned that title. I had to apply for it, I think, 3 times. And therefore, you're going to keep it even if you no longer are working. I've retired officially from the University of Sunderland. So they let me keep the title, which is nice.
I want to be an emeritus.
Emeritus.
I can't say it. An emeritus professor. But if I can't say the word, I probably stand no chance. So, Kevin, could you start off just by explaining a broad sort of idea of what is assisted suicide and what is the case for assisted suicide? Because people will be able to tell from the title of your book that you're against it. So could you make the case for it and just explain what it is?
Yes, of course. I mean, first of all, there are different types of assisted suicide, and many people prefer to call it assisted dying. So, assisted dying is a rubric under which you would include assisted suicide, which means somebody helps a patient to kill themselves, or euthanasia, which is where the doctor gives a fatal injection. So, those are legal in some countries already. So, for instance, the Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, 10 states and one jurisdiction, the Washington, D.C., of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, and Austria is, I believe, the list at the moment. So it's legal in those areas, or various different versions are legal in those areas. Some countries have both legal euthanasia and assisted suicide, and that would include Canada, the Netherlands, whereas most countries probably have more assisted suicide legal. Certainly the states in the United States, Switzerland also, since 1941, the longest running jurisdiction where it's legal, has simply assisting a suicide is legal. And it's not even dictated that it's medical assistance in a suicide in Switzerland.
So you could give somebody a razor to slash their wrists with, effectively. Yes,
as long as you don't have a pecuniary interest in it, as long as you're not gaining financially from assisting that death. However, in practice, it's of course medicalized in Switzerland just as it is everywhere else.
So euthanasia is when the doctor helps kill the patient, and assisted suicide is when just a random person helps.
No, it's euthanasia is when the doctor takes the final action, as in the doctor injects the deadly drugs.
Right.
Whereas assisted suicide is when the patient actually takes the final action, where the doctor hands the deadly drugs to the patient and the patient takes them themselves.
So anywhere that assisted suicide is legal, euthanasia will also be legal. Is that right?
No, in fact, euthanasia is not legal in Switzerland, or I think most of the territories, including Australia, New Zealand, certainly in all of the states in the United States, it's assisted suicide only. It's legal in both in the Netherlands and Canada and Spain and Colombia. I forgot Colombia, sometimes do. And also it's only euthanasia is legal in Belgium. So there they do not allow assisted suicide. They just allow the doctor to take the final action. Mm-hmm. This is very confusing because, of course, there's such a thing as involuntary euthanasia, which, of course, was what happened during the Second World War. And in fact, in pre-war Germany, when it was, legalized, that's where the patient is not consenting to the action. Mm-hmm. Involuntary euthanasia. There is also such a thing as passive euthanasia, which is very confusing because I don't think it's euthanasia at all. And that's where the doctor just simply refuses to treat. So we call it passive euthanasia because it's the doctor's decision, for instance, to end treatment, futile treatment generally. And I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with patients being allowed to stop treatment, to stop eating and drinking if they want. It would be tyranny to force people to live against their will, just as it would be tyranny to lock up, for instance, an alcoholic to prevent them from drinking. That's, I think, abridges their rights, and I think that's important to keep. But when the doctor either helps or takes the final action, that's what we mean by assisted dying.
Okay, and could you make if we're going to steel man this argument, can you make the case for assisted suicide?
The case for is going to be familiar to many of us. Obviously, as old as I am, you two are young'uns, so you wouldn't have this experience yet. But there are, when you've been at the bedside of a person who's dying, it's not that uncommon for the death to be very difficult. So, for instance, I have had when my father died in 2021, it was very, very difficult. It wasn't a great death. And he wanted to end his life beforehand and cried out and said that he wanted to. And you can see that the deathbed scene is a horrific thing whereby there's somebody whose life we see ebbing away, and we all there, and they're not enjoying their life, and we're not enjoying their company. They might have sort of been going already, and many people want to hurry along that process. There's also people want to be assured that their death will not be painful, like they've seen relatives die before. So they think, well, if I have the option of assisted dying, at least that gives me some sort of comfort in order to, that I can approach life in a different way, because I know at the very end that if I need to, I can depart life pretty easily and painlessly.
That sounds quite compelling, though, Kevin. So this is one of those issues that I change my mind on all the time. So you'll have changed my mind one way there with that argument. Do you want to try changing it back the other way with the argument against?
Well, yes, I think, most deaths are peaceful is the one thing. And so it's based on fear, a lot of this. So even according to Dignity in Dying, which is the leading organization that's trying to promote a change in the law, only 17 deaths per day are actually difficult ones. So it's addressing a problem that doesn't generally exist. Most deaths are peaceful. Most people, obviously, in that horrible situation, want to die. My father wanted to die when he thought that he had lung cancer. He didn't. But, and he lived for longer than he would have had he not had lung cancer. So prognoses can be wrong. In fact, they often are. And doctors make the point that 6 months to live, which is what is proposed as, for the terminally ill in legislation that we think will come up on November 29th under the Kim Leadbeater bill, the private members bill that's trying to actually make it legal in this country. And generally it's 6 months to live. But of course, that's a random prognosis and it's not accurate. You can't, if you're a doctor, you can't tell somebody 6 months to live. You can tell somebody is going to die within weeks. That's not beyond the ken of doctors. Whereas it's very, very difficult to have an exact prognosis. So that's one argument. Basically, it's addressing a problem that doesn't really exist. It exists in our minds. It exists in drama. I mean, the amount of movies and TV plots that are sort of have this as a central drama is one thing. But most people, by far, less than 1% of all deaths, you will know this, Hilary, as an actuary, there's, 17 deaths per day is not many. It's less than 1% of the people that die every day.
And you said so 17 deaths are difficult. Is that what you said?
That's what.
What does that mean?
Assisted. That's what Dignity in Dying claims. They base it on a various different sort of statistics that are available and extrapolate quite a bit to get that. But I
what does that mean?
That's not a bad.
17 deaths are difficult. I don't really understand what that means.
Well, it means they're either painful or distressing in some ways. The person is restless or whatever. So I accept that there are painful. I've been at the bedside of several deaths. And one of them, I probably, if I was asked, was that last week worth it? No, I don't think it was. And my grandmother can only cry out, want to die. She had emphysema, and it was not a very nice way to die. Did she really want to? I don't know. I wasn't confident enough to put a pillow over her face, which is, if somebody's really unbearably suffering, you kind of think, well, hopefully we'd be, stand up enough to actually end it ourselves. But I mean, I think that's a key thing, is that human beings are not built like that, and we're very much resisting killing, and I think that's a good thing. You were just going to interrupt.
Yeah, I guess on this theme, people, I think, generally imagine that assisted dying is for the old, but I think it was Ray Tallis, the doctor and author. I remember reading one of his books, and he was saying that the the general way that people die at old age is that they sleep more and they sleep more and they do gently drift into death, which is, that's a nice way to think of going, isn't it? But would it not be the case that those difficult deaths that you're describing are probably not the older people? Are they younger people?
They can be any age. It really depends. And I believe that there are difficult deaths, and I believe there are ones. I'm not against assisted suicide per se. I'm against a change in the law. And those are two very, very different things. Assisted suicide, in some instances, might be appropriate, but it's pretty rare. And not only that, but the other, I suppose my case against it is threefold. First of all, I think it addresses a problem in the wrong way, and the problem is generally not in the way that people imagine it. And the second point is it actually does real harm, which I can point to. And the third point is I think it really undermines some of our mores in society, which I think is the most serious thing, including our ability to prevent suicide. Or, I think our attitude towards human life can be affected by this entirely. So on the first point, the other interesting study that's come out is a Dutch study that shows, and in the Netherlands, it's been legal since 2002, euthanasia and assisted suicide. And about 5.5% of all deaths are by either euthanasia or assisted suicide, mostly euthanasia.
So 1 in 20 deaths. 1 in 20 deaths is by euthanasia.
Correct.
Wow.
Yes. In Canada, the statistic is even worse. It's growing at a huge rate, a rate of knots, as they say. And in Quebec, it's about 8%, and Vancouver Island, it's about 8%. And it's 4 times the suicide rate, which is kind of fascinating, I would think. So, yeah, the study in the Netherlands, where it's been legal for such a long time, about between 28.6 and 42.8% of all deaths are actually suffer from either pain or restlessness. So it's, even though they have this cure, you can't get rid of various different things about death. And as a friend of mine, one Anne Ferrady, made a point in my session. You can't tell things about, you imagine birth and you imagine death, and both of them are nothing like what you imagine them. So if, like I remember with our children, you're both too young to, of course, have children or anything else like that. But when we had our children, we had a birth plan, which involved a birthing pool and all sorts of whale music and crap like that. And of course, the actual birth was messy and traumatic and just nothing like what we expected it to be. And life is messy. And this seems to me an attempt to kind of schedule your death according to your diary. It's got a sort of really strange way of I want to control everything, and parts of life are just not controllable. I'll pause there so you can ask questions.
There are some horrible examples, aren't there, of people who've been granted euthanasia who are perhaps very young and just have things like depression rather than incurable diseases. That seems to me the slippery slope worry that I would have about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a real point to that. I don't like the term slippery slope because it assumes that the thing that we're trying to do in the first place is right, whereas I prefer moral precipice, because I think once you do that, you are down. You're going down. The problem is that if you have an equal perspective on human life, like the SDP does, like most political parties, particularly on the left and liberal wings, then you think that everybody should have the same rights. So as soon as you divide off a group of people and you say, we have some new treatment for medical treatment for unbearable suffering, it's death, you have to offer it to more and more people, because more and more people will say, well, I've got 7 months to live and I'm going to suffer more. Somebody else says, I've got Parkinson's, I'm going to suffer, and this is the way it inevitably expands, because basically you make it a cure for not a bad death, but a bad life. And I think that's an important difference, really, is that it becomes something as a solution for people, even with just simply mental health difficulties. And it's, of course, used that way in horrific circumstances in the Netherlands. That's my argument about harm, is basically it's in the Netherlands, at least 9 people have been euthanized for nothing other than being autistic. And the problem is that their lives are completely shattered when their elderly parents go, and they're not able to cope. And there was one horrific case of a young man in his 20s who said that he complained that he could not make social connections. He had no friends, and his doctor euthanized him. And that strikes me as being a horrific kind of thing. And people don't know these things. This is what we try and actually shed light upon, is what the reality of this is.
Yeah, I think it's very, very concerning when we start to play God and we think we can control everything. And I think what you said about life being messy and death being messy is very, it sits with me it resonates with how I feel about the subject. Can I just ask, because we're keen on the sort of solutions, and I know this is a topic where you might say, well, the solution is to not legalize it, but just in terms of solving a bit of a problem regarding people's end-of-life care, is there a way we can improve that, improve palliative care? What would be your ideas for solutions around that?
Precisely, palliative care is the way to go. The good thing about, and particularly hospices, so if you've spent a lot of time in a hospital, it's a pretty miserable place. It's directed towards making people better. It's directed towards comforting people and giving them adequate drugs, but it's much better to die at home or in a hospice. And home is not practical for some people. And a hospice is a very, very good place because it's directed at the whole of the person. My experiences of deaths in hospital is that in comes this doctor to solve this problem. Out goes that doctor. In comes another doctor to solve this problem. No sort of holistic attempt to look at the person. So my poor old mother-in-law, who died aged 95, we kind of thought, why don't you have an idea that, comorbidities, multiple morbidities, it's, there is no great point in doing this sort of treatment, that sort of treatment. She'd given up. She'd stopped taking her medicine. She stopped eating and drinking. Why do we have this? And so a hospital is directed towards that. Palliative care is the way to go. We and Britain have the best palliative care in the world and the best hospice movement. It began here, but we need improvements on that. And that's the way to go.
Okay, great. Finally, then, I don't know if Hilary, you might have something more to add. I just wanted to move this on to the politics of it. Obviously, Kim Ledbetter has put this forward as a private member's bill. Do you think politicians should have a free vote on this? Is it a case of conscience, or should they really be thinking about what their constituents feel?
That's a really good question, because I think it's come up, of course, and some MPs are sort of holding surgeries to see what what people know. I think this is the greatest case for representative democracy, mostly because it takes moral leadership. And if you just ask people who haven't had the time and really don't have the inclination, most people don't want to think about this. So on either side of the question, there is about 4% of people who have a very strong opinion. That's me. That's the other side. In the middle is a huge amount of people who are just if you ask them, do you want a painful death? They'll say no. And so it depends on the way you ask them the question. So if it came up and it was a referendum, and I know some people are saying a referendum is the way to go, no. Whereas a politician, and in particularly on a case like this, there's no party politics involved. They have to act with their conscience. They are responsible to the people they represent, but they have to make that decision. And I think it's a great case for representative democracy. Certainly not for citizens' juries, as it's been done elsewhere. and certainly not. I don't think a referendum is another good way. It would just be very, very false and be superficial. Whereas this, I've been impressed with how seriously politicians actually take this. I've been very impressed by the people I've spoken to on either side of the question, and they really deliberate on this, and I think that's a good thing.
So on quite a sensitive and quite a morbid topic, you've provided a note of positivity, which is the case for representative democracy. I think that's excellent.
That's great. Yes, thanks, Kevin. You've talked me around again. I'm against it again now. So
typical politician, flip-flopping.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a difficult subject, and I know many people who go back and forth on it. Certainly, you should be against the lead-beater bill because it's not even being presented yet, and I don't think we'll see it before 2 weeks before, and that's hardly enough time to actually really consider this bill.
And what do you think its chances are? Do you think it will go through?
Initially, I thought it would just simply go through. But more and more people that I'm speaking to are thinking again. That's our kind of phrase that we're going. So I'm being asked by multiple MPs to come and speak to them because they're undecided. I also think there's a really interesting dynamic because although this is a private member's bill, it's a quasi-government bill because Starmer has come out in favour of it. And I think there's an interesting dynamic with Starmer tried to shut his cabinet up, but he didn't. And West Streeting came out against it. And not only that, but other organizations are really coming out against it. We're sort of unveiling them in the near future. So there are lots of things going on afoot. And it's I think there's a kind of dynamic between Starmer and West Streeting. And I think it's one that West Streeting will win. That's my guess on it. That's my exclusive political take on it. I think but yes, having spoken to quite a few people, they're not happy with the whole process of the thing. And the fact that it's a private member's bill, which gets a maximum of 5 hours of deliberation, which is not a lot. And so it's a lot of people don't like the process, even if they're fairly sympathetic towards the cause.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing all that with us, Kevin. I think that everybody will feel that they're much more on top of the subject now than they were half an hour ago.
Yeah, and keep an eye out for
Thanks, and sorry to depress you all.
No, not at all. It's been really interesting. Keep an eye out for the debate in Parliament, which will be on the 29th of November. I'm sure the news will cover that. Thank you, Kevin, for all of that. And if anybody's interested, the book that Kevin wrote on this is called Assisted Suicide, The Liberal Humanist Case Against Legalisation.
And if you want to help or you want any more information, then feel free to email me. I'm very easy to find.
So finally, we come to our Culture Club section where we recommend or chat about some of the issues in the cultural field. So, shall we give Kevin a rest? Do you want to start, Sebastian?
Yes, indeed. So this was foreshadowed at the start of the show, but I would like to talk about Dorset because I don't often extol the virtues of my home region, but having been there this week, I can say it is a wonderful place, and it perhaps doesn't get the same sort of reputation as maybe Cornwall or Devon, but Dorset really is a stunning part of the country. And I particularly want to talk about travel within the UK because I'm 28 and I've travelled extensively, really all over the world, and yet I've seen far too little of my own country. And partly that is due to huge rail prices and the difficulties in going from one part of the country to the other. Hotels are very expensive. Luckily, I was staying with an old school friend who was very, very, her parents were very gracious and welcomed me with open arms, which was so nice. But Dorset's just lovely. And I was stood on the cliffs by Old Harry Rocks, for anybody that knows it. And I was just looking across along the cliffs, these amazing white cliffs, and thinking, our country is just astonishing, really. To have, we're an island, and there are a lot of countries out there that don't have such an amazing coastline, and the fact that really it's a political achievement that we've protected those coastal areas. The Isle of Purbeck is just a gem, and okay, it gets a little bit crowded during the summer, but if you go at this time of year, it's relatively quiet, and you can walk across miles and miles. The Southwest Coast Path goes from Poole in Dorset all the way down to Land's End and then up to Minehead in North Devon. It's the longest path in the country, and it's unbroken, so you can walk all the way along it, as people have completed the whole thing, and it's just an amazing part of the world. And finally, just on that, I've never been a member of the National Trust. My friend is a member, and so we went to one of the stately homes, Kingston Lacey. I think we should really be promoting these stately homes, and we're walking around and you get this sense of awe and wonder that, honestly, if you're living in a suburb of Manchester, going about your life day in, day out, you probably don't get that emotion. But there's plenty of stately homes even around Manchester. So I would encourage anybody to get out there, go and visit these places, and I would encourage our politicians to enable the public to go and see more of their own country. A real unionist approach to this would be to say, encourage English people to go on holiday to Scotland. At the moment it's just too expensive, and young people are encouraged to go to Greece and Spain, and it would be great if we could travel a bit more around the country.
And that was an advert for the British Tourist Board. Thank you, Sebastian. So I wanted to talk a little bit about going to gigs. So, Sebastian, do you know the phrase "doing the 92"?
No.
Do you, Kevin?
No.
So, doing the 92 is a football thing.
The class of 92?
Where you go to all the football grounds
of
all the teams in all the leagues.
Oh, because there's 92 teams?
Yes, yeah. So that's the kind of thing you do in the football arena. But I was kind of spurred to try to visit more music venues, because I don't know if you noticed when Oasis announced their new tour, 2/3 of the venues that they played in their 94 tour are now closed. So, there is a real crunch in the music venue industry. So, post-lockdown, because I missed going to gigs so much during lockdown, so post-lockdown, I started a spreadsheet of all my gigs, who I saw, where I saw them, who the support band were. I'm great on spreadsheets. And what I've been trying to do is to visit more venues that I've never been to. So the other week I was in Leeds at the Brudenell Social Club, which was fantastic to see Ferocious Dog, who were great. And last night I was in Aylesbury, actually at the Aylesbury Theatre, but at a gig organised by, there's this organisation, Friars of Aylesbury, who've had various venues over the years, but were the people who put on David Bowie's first Ziggy Stardust gig, who put on The Clash, The Ramones, all these bands that Sebastian's looking at me completely perplexed because he's never heard of.
I feel very uncool when you talk about music, and you were at a gig last night.
Yes, so I was in Aylesbury last night to see Public Service Broadcasting, so that was great fun. So if anybody has recommendations for venues I've not been to, then email us and I will try to fit them in.
Excellent.
Sunderland Fire Station, have you been there?
Sunderland Fire Station? No, I've not. I shall add that to my list.
You should definitely add that to your list. And there's some very good Newcastle events as well. It's a friend of mine gets very cheap tickets to various different things. So we have been to see, I can't remember who, Roger Daltrey, who was very good, very entertaining.
The Who?
Yes, he didn't have the whole Who with him.
No, but I'm getting
doesn't tour.
For anybody that can't
very good
see,
actually spotting the band, Sebastian, for a 28-year-old. That's very impressive.
I'm getting an approving nod from Hilary.
So there's all sorts of good gigs to go to, and I love live music. I think you're absolutely right to support live music. It makes all the difference. My current favorite, who I have seen several times, is Samantha Fish Band, which is like a blues country from across the water.
Okay.
She's from Kansas.
Look out for her.
But She's very, very good. If you like blues, then you would like her, and and she puts on a good show.
Great. And do you have a Culture Club recommendation yourself, Kevin?
Yep. You know what? I'm going to actually go and do choirs because I sing in a choir. I sing second tenor in the Usha College choir. And I have sung in choirs for about 15 years. It's something that I really enjoy because it takes me completely away from the day job, from whatever else I'm doing. And it forces your mind to go in a different direction. And I find it's a bit like when you don't speak a language. I get there and there's all these people who speak music keys and they say things like, no, it's a demi-semitone, it's an A sharp major, and I'm going, deer in the headlights look that I've got. But it's fantastic. You're learning all of the time, and you're also starting to appreciate different music. I love classical music, but before I joined a choir, I knew very little classical music that was from about 1945 onwards. I only liked music before then. And now I've learned a lot. There's James Macmillan, who's a wonderful, he's younger than me as well, James Macmillan, and he's a good composer. So there's all sorts, and you can just discover it. And it's given me a different dimension to learn about music. But and also England's a fantastic place for this, which I completely agree with you, Sebastian. This is a wonderful country that's underappreciated by people in it, including my own children. I have the zeal of a convert, having got my British citizenship not that long ago, despite living here for a long time. And I love it. And it's got a certain culture to it. You have these little choirs here and there, and you can have amateur ones. You can have slightly more professional ones. I think it's a great place.
How would you find your local choir?
I look it up if I were looking, I would just look up on the interweb to work out where it is, and just look up local choirs. And there's a music service generally. It tends to be a lot of teachers, music teachers, because what the hell else are you going to do with a music degree if you can't make money? So they all become music teachers, but they love music, and they tend to organize and sing in choirs and other musical ensembles.
Fabulous. And if anybody can't get out to a choir, can I just give a little plug for Opera North, who are running their From Couch to Choir training session online. So if you search for Opera North, you can sign up to that. Starts next week, I think.
Fantastic.
Excellent. I think that brings us to an end. So thank you, Kevin, for coming on and talking to us about assisted suicide. That was really interesting. And we covered the budget, we covered Trump and Harris. It's been a wide-ranging show today.
So, as always, do follow us, recommend us, share us, and we'll see you next week.
Exactly. And if you've got a question or anything to add, email us. Our email addresses are in the show notes. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.